Hey there, I'm Bex. Welcome to my channel. In this video, I thought I'd show you how I painted this rabbit in watercolour and guide you through my entire process step by step so that you can follow along with me if you would like to. So first off, I wanted to find a really good reference picture. So for this, I went to unsplash.com. This is a really fantastic resource for stock images and it is great for artists if you're looking for good images to paint and you're not able to paint from life and you maybe don't have a photograph of a particular subject that you're interested in. So I headed over to Unsplash and I looked at loads of pictures of rabbits, eventually landing on this one, which is so stinking cute. Once I get my image into the PC, I like to create a few different versions of it. So I'll maybe adjust the levels a little, bump up the contrast in one of the examples, maybe make another reference that shows the grayscale. I usually work from grayscale images because to be honest, I like to experiment with colour an awful lot. So for me, most of the time, I'm focusing on capturing the values rather than capturing the realistic colours. Although in this particular piece I decided to focus a little more on trying to get those natural colours right. All of the watercolours that I used for this piece are from White Nights. I absolutely love their paints. They are really reasonably priced, very pigmented, and just lovely quality. I'm having so much fun experimenting and working with them. So if you're in the market for some watercolours, I would definitely recommend checking them out. On that note, if you live in the UK, Jackson's Art sells these watercolours for quite a bit cheaper than Amazon, so make sure you compare both. The colours I picked for this particular piece were Naples Yellow. I used a little bit of Cadmium Red, Raw Sienna, Umber, and Chromium Oxide. I really like these colours. I think they're very earthy and the cadmium red just provides a little bit of extra brightness. I love chromium oxide. It has quickly become one of my favourite colours. It is just so gorgeous and it granulates beautifully. So anyway, on to the drawing. It is time to get painting. First off, I spent a little time just sketching out the rabbit, thinking about the position of things, if there's anything that I maybe wanted to change or modify slightly, but I tried to stay fairly close to my reference and really just wanted to make sure that I had the proportions and the angle of the face and the structure of the head kind of right. I mean, for watercolours, you really don't need a detailed sketch, but you do want to have a good drawing of your subject to start with, because if you start with a drawing and the proportions are off, painting it isn't really going to make that look any better. So I would recommend that you spend a good little bit of time on your sketch, and once you're happy with it, you can gently dab a kneaded eraser on it or even roll it over the surface just to lift the excess graphite off of the paper. This just means that when you apply your watercolour over the top, if there isn't any excess graphite, then you won't get any dirty marks. If you leave too much graphite on your page, especially a lighter colour like yellow, can pick it up and it makes the colour kind of muddy. It is not the best look unless that is something you want to achieve. Just take your kneaded eraser across that, and once you've done that, we are ready to apply some masking fluid. I've used this a couple of times now, and to be honest, I really am not that happy with it. I found that the blue kind of colour of the masking fluid stains the paper slightly or just is really, really difficult to get off. I have been using a masking fluid remover block, and even with that, I still see these residual little bits of blue on my sheet. So I would really recommend, if you're using masking fluid, to go for some Winsor & Newton masking fluid. I've used that for years and it's very reliable and it is what I will use going forward. It's a real shame though, because the pen form is really good for drawing, and maybe on a smooth hot pressed paper it will be better. So I will try that and another week let you know if it is any better. This particular painting is on Archie's rough watercolour paper. I really love the texture of rough paper, and if you want to follow along with me, you can use any paper that you have available, as long as it's watercolor paper. If you're an absolute beginner, make sure, if you only have a small budget, invest in paper, because if you're using wood pulp paper and not 100% cotton paper, you're going to be fighting your paints like crazy. I cannot believe the difference that switching to 100% cotton paper made for me personally when I was starting out with watercolour. And honestly, I think the quality of the paper is more important than the quality of the paints that you use. So anyway, this is Arches 100% cotton watercolour paper, and this is a watercolour block. So when starting to build up the paint on the face, I decided to work wet next to wet, if you know what I mean. So I picked colours that were similar but made sure that there was slight variations in it, just so that when the watercolour was dry, the tones would be varied and more interesting than just painting with one flat brown colour. I think this really helped pull the piece together, and it's something that I've been experimenting quite a lot with. You might also notice that I'm painting at an angle, and this is just really for personal preference, but I do like the water to be able to flow downwards, and this can change depending on what type of subject I'm painting. You can see I'm also bringing in some of that cadmium red into the face, and I've done this really just to make sure that there was some variation in the fur tone, and also because I knew I would be using this in the ear area and the nose area, I wanted to make sure that the whole piece felt cohesive, and a good way of doing that is to make sure that you use your colours and kind of dot them about all over the canvas, just to make sure that everything looks like one, like it should be together. For this part of the painting, I am also using a brush from Jackson's Art. This is a quill brush and it's a size 0. I love this brush so much. It is my favourite and it is my go-to. I would really recommend picking one up. It's so versatile, it has a nice point, it keeps its shape, it holds loads of water, and I have found myself reaching for this brush nearly every single time I sit down to paint in watercolour. It is my firm favourite and I love it. I made sure my brush was slightly wetter while I was working on the body of the rabbit. I wanted to let the colours flow into each other quite a lot and leave a lot of kind of deliberate texture and abstract marks. I just think that this is more interesting than leaving it flat, and it also helps to kind of fade the body out so that the focus remains on the face, which is the central point of the piece. You can see at this part of the painting I started to bring in some warmer tones, so really the warmest tones that I'm using are Naples Yellow and Raw Sienna. These colours are absolutely gorgeous and they both granulate, so they leave a really lovely texture behind. Also, while my paint is still wet, if I want to soften up some of my edges, I'll just take my brush, make sure it is clean and really pretty dried off, maybe just slightly damp, and just take that to the edges of the lines that you want to soften, and this will create a softer line without causing a back run, which can happen if you still have too much water on your brush. Another thing that I would mention is it is definitely a good idea to try to leave the paint that you put down and let it flow and do its thing naturally. Don't foot around with it too much because it can cause blooms and leave kind of irregular marks and textures behind in your work that you might not want. It is quite easy when you are maybe wanting to darken down an area more to have a little too much water on your brush still, and when this happens and you put your brush down, it ends up pushing the pigment away from the brush, and this might not be what you want to achieve, especially if you are trying to darken an area. So if you do feel like an area is too light and you'd like to darken it more, your options are really to wait until the paper is fully dry and do it on another layer, or you can pick up some quite strong pigment and just make sure that your brush is as kind of dry as it can be before laying that colour in, and that will let the pigment spread out and merge with the other ones as long as the paper is still wet enough without causing any backruns. While I'm working on the face, I'm constantly looking back at my reference before I put another bit of paint down, checking the values really carefully and looking for subtle changes in the tone of the fur and maybe adjusting my colours to suit that. You can use whatever colours you like for your painting. You don't need to use realistic colours if you want to follow along with this. You can use your favourite colours, anything you like, as crazy as you want, as long as you pay attention to the values. I would recommend that if you want to be really free with your colours, to print out your reference image in grayscale and work from that, because if you are trying to translate colours into different colours, it can be more difficult to understand and see those value relationships clearly. Once I was almost finished the first layer, I decided that I really wanted to add in some vivid splashes of colour and add in some abstract marks into the background just to make the piece a little bit more interesting and to help pull the whole thing together. So all I done was diluted some of the paint that I had left in my palette, some of the mixtures with plenty of water, and made some interesting abstract marks with my brush. Once I had done that, I went in for some of that cadmium red, and I also used a little bit of quinacridone rose, mixed them together and splattered them on the page using my mop brush. There are a few different ways to do this. You can just use the brush and a flicking motion to create the splatters if you're confident enough with your control. If not, you can make sure that you cover any areas that you don't want to be splattered, and you can always use another brush to tap your brush on the back of. But what I would recommend is, if you want to use the splatter technique, just get a scrap piece of paper and practice with the different types of marks you can make, the different angles you can hold your brush, and the different techniques for doing it. And once you feel comfortable enough to take it to your main painting, go for it and just have fun. I love doing this. The randomness and kind of spontaneity of it I think is amazing, and it's something really, really fun that you can do with watercolour, and because of the transparency of the paper, I think it just adds a really, really nice touch to the whole thing. So once I had added my splatters, I let my painting dry completely. Now, this takes around an hour, I would say, if you want to be safe. Depending on what country you live in, it might take longer or it might be quicker, but just make sure there is absolutely no sheen on your paper, and you should see your paper start to level off again if there are slight waves and things in it once it is dry. Definitely make sure that your paper is taped down unless you're using a watercolour block like I am, although you can tape them for a little extra security if you feel like you need to. Now, the reason that I left my painting to dry at this stage is because I knew I wanted to go in and add more detail on top of what I had already created as a base. If I had tried to do this while the painting was still wet, my pigments would have run into each other and bled, and I wouldn't be able to get the crisp lines that I was looking for. So it is kind of up to you, whatever stage you feel is appropriate, I guess, for moving on to the next layer. But just remember that, you know, once you want to add any kind of detail, you're going to have a much easier time if you're working on a dry layer. When you're working on this second layer, you can play with adding some texture to the fur. I don't personally like to go overboard with this, maybe just a few suggestions, some sweeping lines to suggest the fur is there, and you know, let the viewer's brain fill in the rest. Us humans are really good at looking at something and interpreting it, so don't worry too much about getting every single strand of hair and detail that you see in your reference picture. Don't afraid to be loose and experimental, although if that is your style and the way that you like to work, feel free to go absolutely crazy with detail and spend hours and hours on the piece. Really, at the end of the day, there is no right way to do art. There are just useful techniques that you can employ in your work and that might help you achieve what you personally envision when you set out to create a painting. On this layer, I wanted to focus on darkening down some of the values, but also improving the vibrancy of certain areas. And often with the lighter colours like the Naples yellow, the raw sienna, and the cadmium red, you can put down a little bit extra colour on top of your first layer, and that just really increases the saturation of the colour. It will make it slightly darker, but it improves the vibrancy. So just practice with that and don't worry too much about everything being perfect. Another technique you'll see me using in this painting is colour lifting, and there are a few different ways to do this. It can be really helpful if you've gone slightly too dark in an area. So all you need to do is take a clean damp brush, and while your paint is still wet, just rub it very gently on the paper. You don't want to disturb the surface of the paper too much, just enough to encourage the pigment to lift. Now, if you wipe your brush on paper towel, give it a good clean again, get it nice and dry and drag it over that area, you will be able to lift up some of that pigment and achieve a kind of lighter colour. Now, some watercolours lift easier than others. A lot of the colours I used in this particular piece are not staining, which means the pigment size is larger and the pigment tends to sit on the surface of the paper. So this technique is much more successful with colours like that. With other colours like the ruby, that is a staining colour and that is very hard to lift. Often you can lighten it a little bit, but you will struggle to actually lift away all of the pigment, and I wouldn't recommend really trying that because you're risking damaging your paper. One other method for lifting watercolours is you can again just take a clean and damp brush onto the area and then dab it with some kitchen roll, and that will help pull up the pigment as well. So experiment with both techniques, see what you like and what works for you, and all I would say is try not to go too overboard with this. If you're careful, you will be able to lift the paint up and have another go at maybe adding in a different colour or making just adjustments as you see fit. Once again, when I was happy with my second layer, I let it dry completely, and that let me move on to the next step, removing the masking fluid. And man, I love this part, it's so much fun. To remove the masking fluid, I am using a masking fluid block from Frisk, I think the company is, and it is almost like, I don't know, it has a very strange rubbery texture which seems to grip the masking fluid really well and makes it a lot easier to remove. By no means do you need this. This is a product I picked up recently and I found it useful, but you can just use your finger, just make sure your hands are clean, and it will be easy enough to remove. I would say though that the masking fluid remover has definitely helped. It is very easy to use and it helps pull the masking fluid off much easier than using your finger. You can also use an eraser as well, just be careful that you are not too rough with your paper. Now, the downside of masking fluid is it can leave some very rough and hard edges, but because a lot of the colours I'm using are granulating and can be lifted quite easily, it means that those edges can be softened with a damp brush. So it really just depends. Personally, I quite like the look of the hard lines in the masking fluid in some areas, so it's really just personal preference at this point. There's really no right or wrong way to do things. At this stage, now that the masking fluid was off, I wanted to add in a bit of a background, and for this I went to my favourite colour, chromium oxide, and I decided to rotate my watercolour block for this. The main reason for this is I wanted to control the direction that the pigment would flow in and make sure that the edges around the rabbit, where the light, especially on the top of the head, is hitting very strong, I wanted to make sure that my colours didn't bleed into that and that I wasn't left with some very, very harsh edges in those areas. I wanted to keep it quite soft and light. And for this part of the painting, I decided to use the wet on wet technique. So I went in and wet my paper first. When you do this, you don't want your paper to be soaking wet, you don't want puddles, you just want it to be wet enough that there is a slight sheen to it. I'll make a video in the future about all of these different watercolour techniques so that you can refer to them. I feel like it would be beneficial to have that as a resource, so I'll get on that very soon. But in the meantime, just make sure your paper is wet but not soaking wet, and that there is a slight sheen to the surface of it, and you can't really go wrong. Also, any areas that you leave dry will not be affected by the paint, but if you bring your pigment close to the edge of a wet wash, it might leave a hard edge where that wash stops. So that's just something to bear in mind. If you want some nice soft edges, make sure you wet the whole area, and then when you drop your pigment in, just be careful not to go too close to the area that you want to keep white. Having your paper at an angle as well is very helpful for this because it stops the pigment running against gravity, you know. So for the face area of the rabbit, I knew I didn't want the green to pour onto it, so I used the wet on wet technique. And then with my paper at this angle, it meant when I dropped my green in, it would automatically want to flow with gravity down towards the outer edges of the painting and not in towards the face, but it would still leave me those really nice soft edges that I wanted. I also went in and added a few warmer tones to the background just to tie it in a little more with the fur. Obviously the other colours I had already placed in the background were still peeking through, but I wanted to have a little bit more of that Naples yellow in with the chromium oxide, so I mixed a little bit of that in too. And so to finish off the painting, I decided to add some more abstract marks in the background. This is really just a personal style choice. It's totally up to you if you want to do this. Maybe you want to try something different. I also used this really thin brush. It is called a rigger brush, and this brush I found particularly useful for adding thin lines and details. So I used this and some white ink. It's Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed proof white ink. I used that to add in the whiskers, or maybe just recover any highlights that had gone a little bit too dark or missing. If I wanted to draw a little bit of extra attention to an area, I would say with this, use it very sparingly and as little as possible. I also used the rigger brush to add some veins to the inside of the ear. I just thought that this area really needed something to make it a little more interesting, and personally I really like how this turned out. I think it's quite cool, and the translucency of the ear I think I managed to keep intact. I had a lot of fun with that, and I'm looking forward to messing about with bits and pieces like that again. So really, I just wanted to make sure all of the detail was kept in the face and around the ear area, with the body and the background really just fading out to these abstract blobs and just kind of letting the watercolour do its thing, creating lots and lots of fun and interesting textures. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video and I hope you found this tutorial useful. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments and I will do my best to reply to each and every one of them. I love you guys so much. Thank you sincerely for supporting my work. Let me know if there are any tutorials you would like to see in the future, and have a fantastic day. If you like my work, you can follow me on all of my social medias. They are linked in the description. And if you want to hang out with me on Twitch, I occasionally do live stream over there. If you really love the channel and would like to support me in other ways, you can become a patron, which is in no way expected, but is hugely helpful for me upgrading my equipment and getting these videos out to you every week. If you really like how this painting turns out, you can find the original in my shop, which is also linked in the description, along with about 20 or 30 other original paintings, and obviously for these there is only one of each available, so if you would like to get your hands on this, go and check that out. Anyway, have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next week. Bye!